I didn't take the job because I wanted it. I took it because everything else had fallen apart. Student debt, a useless degree, a lease that vanished overnight. By the time the Forest Service posting appeared, I was already packing. 6:30 a.m., alone in a McDonald's parking lot that wasn't even open. My life fit into a duffel bag and an overstuffed backpack. Signal Peak was just a job. At least that's what I thought. The drive took 11 hours through winding mountain roads that seemed to narrow with every mile. My phone lost signal somewhere around hour 8, and by the time I reached the ranger station, the sun had already dipped behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. The station itself was a squat wooden building with peeling green paint and a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired spine. A single fluorescent light buzzed above the door, flickering in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at that light, wondering if it was too late to turn around. But there was nothing to turn around to. No apartment, no job, no one waiting for me anywhere. I grabbed my bags and walked toward the door. The man who greeted me was named Earl Whitmore, and he looked like he had been carved from the same wood as the trees surrounding us. Deep lines etched his face, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much and saying too little. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm, but not aggressive, and he studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "You must be the new one," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling down a dry riverbed. I nodded and told him my name. He repeated it once, as if testing how it felt in his mouth, then turned and gestured for me to follow him inside. The station smelled like old coffee and wood smoke, and the walls were covered with maps so faded that the trails had become ghost lines, barely visible against the yellowed paper. Earl pointed to a desk in the corner and told me that would be my spot. He handed me a thick binder filled with protocols and emergency procedures, and he told me to read it cover to cover before my first patrol. I asked him when that would be, and he said tomorrow at dawn. "You don't waste time out here," he added. "The forest doesn't wait for anyone." That night, I slept in a small cabin about a quarter mile from the station. The bed was narrow and the mattress was thin, but I was so exhausted that I fell asleep within minutes. I dreamed of trees, endless rows of them stretching toward a sky that was not quite black but not quite anything else either. In the dream, I was walking through the forest, and I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace exactly. Every time I stopped, the footsteps stopped. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just trees, just shadows, just the feeling of being watched by something I could not see. I woke up before my alarm, drenched in sweat, with the distinct impression that I had not been alone in that cabin. The first week passed in a blur of orientations, trail maps, and radio protocols. Earl was patient but distant, answering my questions with the minimum number of words required and never offering more than what was asked. The other ranger at the station was a woman named Agnes Pritchard, and she had been working Signal Peak for almost 30 years. She was small and wiry, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. On my third day, I asked her what had happened to the ranger I was replacing. She paused for a long moment, her hands frozen over the logbook she had been writing in, and then she said a single word: "Gone." I waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. She just went back to writing, and the scratch of her pen against paper was the only sound in the room for what felt like hours. I learned quickly that Signal Peak was not like other forests. There was something about the way the trees grew here, too close together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so dense that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. The trails were narrow and winding, often disappearing entirely beneath carpets of dead leaves and fallen needles. And there was the silence. In most forests, there is always some sound: birds calling, insects humming, wind rustling through leaves. But Signal Peak had a different kind of silence, the kind that felt heavy and intentional, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By the end of my second week, I had memorized most of the trails and could navigate the main routes without consulting my map. Earl seemed satisfied with my progress, though he never said so directly. Agnes remained distant, speaking to me only when necessary and always watching me with those unsettling eyes. I started to wonder if I had done something to offend her, but when I asked Earl about it, he just shook his head. "Agnes has been here a long time," he said. "She's seen things. Don't take it personally." I wanted to ask what things, but something in his tone told me I wouldn't like the answer. The first disappearance happened on a Tuesday in early October. A hiker named Chester Murdoch had set out on the Ridgeline Trail 3 days earlier, planning a solo overnight trip to the summit. He was experienced, well-equipped, and had filed a detailed itinerary with the station before departing. When he failed to check in at the scheduled time, Earl organized a search party. I was part of the team that found his campsite. The tent was still standing, the flaps zipped tight from the outside. Inside, we found his sleeping bag, his pack, his water bottles, and his boots. His boots. I remember staring at them for a long moment, trying to understand. Chester Murdoch had walked into this forest wearing those boots, and now they were here, neatly placed beside his sleeping bag, while he was nowhere to be found. We searched for 6 days. We brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 neighboring counties. We covered every inch of that mountain, every trail, every creek bed, every abandoned cabin. We found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign that Chester Murdoch had ever left that campsite. On the 7th day, the search was called off, and Chester Murdoch was added to the list. I didn't know about the list until Agnes showed it to me. It was kept in a locked drawer in her desk, a simple leather-bound notebook filled with names and dates going back over 100 years. Some entries had additional notes, last known location, items found, witness accounts, but most were just names and dates, stark and simple, like headstones in a cemetery. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Agnes closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. "Enough," she said. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence outside my window. And then, somewhere in the darkness, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, so faint that I thought at first I was imagining it. But it was there, drifting through the trees, calling out a name that I could not quite make out. I got up and went to the window. The forest was pitch black, the trees nothing more than darker shapes against an already dark sky. The voice came again, closer this time, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it was calling my name. I stood frozen at that window for what felt like hours, listening as the voice circled the cabin, sometimes close enough that I could almost make out individual words, sometimes fading into the distance until it was barely a whisper. When dawn finally came, I was still standing there, my forehead pressed against the cold glass, my breath fogging the window in rapid bursts. I told Earl about the voice that morning. He listened without interrupting, his face expressionless, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk and pulled out a small leather pouch. He handed it to me without explanation. I opened it and found a collection of items inside. A dried flower, a small stone with strange markings, a lock of gray hair tied with a red thread. "What is this?" I asked. Earl just shook his head. "Keep it with you," he said, "always. And if you hear that voice again, don't answer, never answer." I wanted to demand an explanation, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was the same look I had seen in Agnes's eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much and learned that some questions are better left unasked. The second disappearance happened 2 weeks later. This time, it was a family, Vernon and Mildred Ashworth and their 2 children, a boy named Theodore and a girl named Opal. They had rented one of the backcountry cabins for a weekend getaway, and when they failed to return their keys on Sunday evening, Agnes drove out to check on them. She found the cabin exactly as Chester's campsite had been found. Everything in place, personal belongings untouched, no sign of struggle or distress. The only unusual detail was the dinner table. It was set for 4, with plates of food still sitting in front of each chair. The food had long since gone cold and begun to rot, but the arrangement was perfect, as if the family had sat down for a meal and then simply vanished between one bite and the next. The search for the Ashworths was even more extensive than the search for Chester, but the results were the same. We found nothing, no bodies, no trails, no explanation, just another set of names added to the leather notebook in Agnes's drawer. I started keeping a journal after that, writing down everything I observed, every strange sound, every unexplained occurrence. I told myself it was for documentation purposes, that I was being professional and thorough, but the truth was that I was terrified, and writing things down made them feel more manageable somehow, more contained. October bled into November, and the forest began to change. The leaves fell in thick carpets that muffled every footstep, and the fog rolled in each morning, dense and gray and cold. The days grew shorter, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, eager and patient. I started seeing things in the trees, shapes that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, shadows that seemed too dark, too solid, too deliberate. Sometimes, when I was alone on patrol, I would catch a glimpse of something just at the edge of my vision, a figure standing motionless between the trunks, watching me with eyes I could feel but never see. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the stress and isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the leather pouch never left my pocket. And I never went into the forest after dark. Not anymore. The third disappearance was different. It happened on a night in late November during the first snowfall of the season. I was in the station filing reports when the radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end was frantic, broken by static and fear. "This is Clarence," the voice said. "Clarence Dobbins. I'm on the North Fork Trail, and there's something out here. Something in the trees. I need help. Please, someone help me." I grabbed the radio and tried to respond, but all I got was static. I tried again and again, adjusting frequencies, checking connections, doing everything I could think of. Nothing worked. The radio was dead. I found Earl in his cabin, already pulling on his boots. He had heard the transmission too. We set out together, flashlights cutting weak paths through the falling snow, and we hiked the 3 miles to North Fork Trail in record time. What we found there still haunts me. Clarence Dobbins was a retired schoolteacher from 2 towns over, a regular visitor to Signal Peak who had been hiking these trails for more than 20 years. We found him sitting against a tree at the side of the trail, his flashlight still clutched in one hand, his eyes wide open and staring at nothing. He was dead. There was no mark on his body, no sign of injury or illness. He was just sitting there, frozen in a posture of absolute terror, his mouth open in a silent scream that would never be heard. The coroner ruled it a heart attack. But I saw the expression on that man's face. I saw the way his fingers had clawed at the bark of the tree behind him, digging furrows deep enough to draw blood. Clarence Dobbins had not died of a heart attack. He had died of fear, pure, overwhelming, incomprehensible fear. After Clarence, I started digging into the history of Signal Peak. I spent my off hours in the county archives, reading through old newspapers and land records and incident reports. What I found was worse than anything I had imagined. The disappearances went back further than Agnes's notebook suggested, much further. The earliest recorded case I could find was from 1847, when a survey party of 7 men entered the forest to map the territory and never returned. Their equipment was found 6 months later, arranged in a perfect circle in a clearing that the local indigenous people refused to enter. Since then, there had been hundreds of cases. Hunters, hikers, loggers, families, children. Some were found like Clarence, dead of apparent natural causes with expressions of unspeakable horror on their faces. Most were never found at all. They simply walked into the forest and ceased to exist, leaving behind only their belongings and the lingering question of what had happened to them. I also found references to something else, something the old reports mentioned only in passing, as if the writers were afraid to commit the words to paper. The Watcher, the Hollow Man, the Thing Between the Trees. Different names for the same entity, a presence that had haunted Signal Peak for as long as anyone could remember. The descriptions varied. Some said it was tall and thin, with limbs like branches and eyes like empty holes. Others said it had no form at all, that it was just a feeling, a presence, a weight in the air that pressed down on you until you couldn't breathe. One account, written by a ranger in 1923, described it as a hole in the shape of a man, a void that walked and watched and waited. I asked Earl about the Watcher one evening, after a particularly difficult patrol. He was sitting on the porch of his cabin, smoking a pipe and staring out at the tree line, and he didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, older, heavy with something that might have been grief. "I've been here 43 years, he said. "I came because I needed a job, same as you. I stayed because by the time I understood what this place was, it was too late to leave. The forest doesn't let you go easily. It gets inside you, plants something deep in your chest, and even when you're miles away, you can feel it pulling you back." He took a long drag from his pipe and let the smoke curl up into the darkening sky. "The Watcher is real," he continued. "I've seen it 3 times in all my years here. Each time was worse than the last. I can't describe it to you because there are no words for what it is. It's not a creature. It's not a ghost. It's something else entirely. Something that exists in the spaces between things, in the silence and the shadows, and the moments when you feel like you're being watched, but you can't see anyone there." He turned to look at me then, and his eyes were filled with a sadness so deep it made my chest ache. "You can't fight it," he said. "You can't run from it. You can't understand it. All you can do is survive it, day after day, until one day you don't." That night, I dreamed of the clearing where the survey party's equipment had been found. In the dream, I was standing in the center of the circle, and the trees around me were moving, bending toward me like curious animals. The sky above was not a sky at all, but a vast, empty darkness that seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. And there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. The Watcher. It was exactly as the 1923 Ranger had described. A void in the shape of a man, a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light around it. It had no face, no features, nothing that could be called a body in any conventional sense. It was simply an absence, a hole in reality, and it was looking at me. I woke up screaming, my throat raw and my sheets soaked with sweat. The leather pouch was clutched so tightly in my fist that the stone inside had drawn blood from my palm. December brought the worst blizzard Signal Peak had seen in 20 years. For 3 days we were trapped in the station, unable to venture outside, watching the snow pile up against the windows until we could barely see the trees beyond. It was during this blizzard that Agnes finally told me her story. We were sitting by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, when she suddenly began to speak. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "I came here in 1994, she said. I was young then, younger than you. I had just finished my degree in forestry, and I thought I was going to save the world one tree at a time." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. My first year was uneventful. I learned the trails, learned the protocols, learned how to survive alone in the wilderness for days at a time. I thought I had this place figured out. I thought I understood it. The fire crackled, and she was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Then came the summer of 1995, she continued. A group of campers went missing, a family of 5, just like the Ashworths. I was part of the search team. We looked for weeks, combing every inch of this forest, and we found nothing, not a trace. On the last day of the search, I got separated from my team. I don't know how it happened. One minute they were there, and the next I was alone, surrounded by trees I didn't recognize, on a trail that wasn't on any map. Her voice grew quieter, and I had to lean in to hear her. I walked for hours, trying to find my way back, and then I saw it. The Watcher. It was standing in a clearing ahead of me, and it was holding something in its hand. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. It was holding a child, a little girl, no more than 5 years old, with blonde hair and a pink dress. She was one of the missing campers, and she was alive. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What did you do?" I asked. Agnes shook her head. What could I do? I tried to approach, tried to save her, but the moment I took a step forward, the Watcher turned to look at me. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, the girl was gone. Just gone. Like she had never existed at all. She looked at me then, and I saw tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That's when I understood," she said. "This forest isn't a place. It's a trap. And the Watcher isn't its guardian. It's its keeper." I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, listening to the storm rage outside and thinking about everything Agnes had told me. I thought about the list of names in her notebook, about Chester and the Ashworths and Clarence, about all the people who had walked into this forest and never walked out. And I thought about the voice I had heard outside my cabin, calling my name in the darkness. When the storm finally broke, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth about Signal Peak, whatever it took. I was going to understand what the Watcher was and what it wanted, and if there was any way to stop it, I was going to find it. The next few weeks were a blur of research and investigation. I tracked down former rangers, local historians, indigenous elders, anyone who might have information about the forest and its dark history. What I learned painted a picture more terrifying than anything I had imagined. Signal Peak had been considered cursed land for centuries. The indigenous tribes who had lived in this region long before European settlers arrived had a name for this place, a name that roughly translated to the Hungry Forest. According to their legends, the forest was home to a spirit of immense power and malevolence, a being that fed on human fear and despair. This spirit had no true form. It was not a god, not a demon, not any creature that could be named or categorized. It was simply hunger given consciousness, emptiness given will. The settlers who came later had their own encounters with the entity. There were records of entire logging camps vanishing overnight, of hunting parties found arranged in strange patterns, of children wandering into the woods and emerging weeks later with no memory of where they had been. The government had tried to close the forest multiple times over the years, but each attempt had failed. The bureaucratic paperwork would get lost, the officials in charge would resign or disappear, and the forest would remain open, waiting for its next victims. I also learned that there had been attempts to destroy the Watcher, to banish it or contain it somehow. None had succeeded. A priest had performed an exorcism in 1952 and was found 3 days later, his body twisted into an impossible position, his face frozen in an expression of ecstatic terror. A team of paranormal investigators had set up camp in the forest in 1978, determined to document and understand the phenomenon. Their equipment was found a month later, scattered across a 5-mile radius, still running, still recording nothing but static and silence. The investigators themselves were never seen again. But there was one thing that gave me hope. A single account, buried in a century-old journal I found in the basement of the county library. It was written by a woman named Dorothea Crane, who had been a schoolteacher in the area in the late 1800s. Dorothea had lost her husband to the forest in 1889. According to her journal, he had gone out hunting one morning and simply never returned. Devastated by grief, Dorothea had done what no one else had ever dared. She had gone into the forest alone, at night, determined to find her husband or die trying. What she found instead was the Watcher. Her description of the encounter was fragmented and difficult to follow, as if she had been writing while in the grip of some powerful emotion. But the key details were clear. The Watcher had approached her, drawn by her grief and fear, and for a moment she had felt certain that she was about to die. But then something had happened. She had stopped being afraid. "I don't know how to explain it," she wrote. "It was as if something inside me simply gave way. I had lost everything, my husband, my hope, my reason for living. What more could this thing take from me?" And in that moment of absolute surrender, I felt the fear leave me. I looked at the darkness before me, and I felt nothing, only peace. And the Watcher had retreated. It had hovered at the edge of the clearing, watching her, and then it had simply faded away, dissolving into the shadows like morning mist burning off in the sun. Dorothea had walked out of the forest unharmed, and she had lived to old age, never returning to Signal Peak, but never forgetting what she had experienced there. The Watcher could be resisted, not through strength or violence or any external force, but through something internal, something that had to do with fear itself. If you could truly stop being afraid, the Watcher lost its power over you. I read Dorothea's journal 3 times that night, committing every word to memory. It wasn't much. A single account, over a century old, with no guarantee that it would work for anyone else. But it was something. It was hope. The next disappearance happened in early January. A young couple named Horace and Etta Mae Pickett had come to Signal Peak for their honeymoon, wanting to escape the noise and crowds of the city for a few days of peace and solitude. They had been staying in one of the backcountry cabins, and when they missed their checkout time, I drove out to investigate. What I found was different from the previous cases. The cabin was not pristine and undisturbed. It was destroyed. The door had been torn off its hinges, the windows smashed, the furniture overturned and broken, and on the walls, written in something dark and viscous that I prayed was not blood, were words. Over and over again, covering every surface, the same 2 words repeated in increasingly frantic handwriting. "It sees." I searched the cabin and found Horace's journal under an overturned mattress. His final entry, dated the night before, described hearing strange sounds outside the cabin. Footsteps that circled endlessly, never approaching but never leaving, accompanied by a voice that whispered their names in tones of terrible intimacy. He wrote that Etta Mae had started acting strangely, staring out the window for hours at a time, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. "She keeps saying it's beautiful," he wrote. "She keeps saying she wants to go to it. I'm scared. I've never been this scared in my life." That was the end of the entry. I found Etta Mae's wedding ring on the floor near the back door, but no other trace of either of them. That night, I made a decision. I was going to confront the Watcher. I was going to walk into the forest alone, find the entity that had been terrorizing this place for centuries, and I was going to test Dorothea's theory. Either I would learn the truth, or I would become another name in Agnes's notebook. Either way, the uncertainty would be over. I didn't tell Earl or Agnes what I was planning. I knew they would try to stop me, and I couldn't risk that. I packed a small bag with supplies, flashlight, water, the leather pouch Earl had given me, and Dorothea's journal, and I waited until midnight. The forest was different at night. The silence that was oppressive during the day became absolute, a void of sound so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching toward me like grasping fingers, and the darkness between them was so dense that my flashlight beam seemed to disappear into it rather than illuminate it. I walked for hours, following no trail, letting instinct guide me deeper and deeper into the heart of Signal Peak. I passed landmarks I recognized, and landmarks I had never seen before, places that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. And all the while, I felt it watching me. The presence was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense that I was not alone. But as I walked, it grew stronger, heavier, until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in clouds of white vapor that hung in the still air like ghosts. And then I found the clearing. It was exactly as I had seen it in my dreams, a perfect circle surrounded by trees that bent inward, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dome of darkness. The ground was covered with dead leaves that crunched beneath my feet with a sound like breaking bones. And there, at the center of the clearing, stood the Watcher. I had thought I was prepared. I had read the accounts, imagined the descriptions, steeled myself for something terrible, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of what I saw. The Watcher was not a creature. It was not a shadow or a void or anything that could be captured in words. It was wrongness itself, a fundamental violation of everything I understood about reality. Looking at it was like looking at a wound in the fabric of existence, a place where the rules that govern the universe simply ceased to apply. It had no face, but I knew it was looking at me. It had no voice, but I could hear it speaking, not with sound, but with something deeper, something that resonated in the core of my being. It spoke my name, and the word carried with it a weight of knowledge that staggered me. Every fear I had ever felt, every shame, every regret, every moment of weakness and despair. The Watcher knew me. It knew me better than I knew myself. I felt the fear then, rising up from some primal place inside me, threatening to overwhelm my consciousness entirely. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee, to escape this impossible thing before me, and for a moment I almost did. But then I remembered Dorothea. I remembered her words, her description of that moment of surrender, and I understood what I had to do. I stopped fighting. I stopped trying to suppress my fear, stopped trying to be brave, stopped trying to resist. I let the fear wash over me, through me, and I accepted it completely. I was terrified. I was alone. I was going to die. And that was okay. In that moment of total acceptance, something shifted. The weight lifted from my shoulders. The cold receded. The Watcher, which had been moving toward me, stopped. I looked at it, really looked at it, without flinching, without turning away, and I felt the strangest thing. Peace. Not happiness, not relief, but a deep, profound peace that seemed to emanate from somewhere beyond myself. I understood then that the Watcher fed on fear, on resistance, on the desperate struggle to survive. When that struggle ceased, when fear was accepted rather than fought, the Watcher had nothing to consume. It was still there, still watching, still impossibly present, but it could not touch me. We stood there for what felt like hours, the Watcher and I, facing each other across the clearing. And then, slowly, it began to fade. Not disappearing exactly, but receding, withdrawing back into whatever space between spaces it called home. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I was alone. I walked out of the forest as the sun rose, following a trail that appeared before me as if the forest itself was guiding me home. I emerged at the ranger station to find Earl and Agnes waiting for me, their faces pale with worry. They didn't ask where I had been. They didn't need to. They could see it in my eyes, the change that had occurred, the understanding I had gained. I stayed at Signal Peak for another 3 years after that night. The disappearances continued, though less frequently than before. I began to teach the other rangers what I had learned, sharing Dorothea's wisdom, helping them understand that the Watcher could be survived if not defeated. Some listened, some didn't. Some walked into the forest one day and never came back. Earl retired in the spring of my 3rd year, leaving Signal Peak for a small house on the coast where he could finally live without the weight of the forest pressing down on him. Agnes stayed, as she always had, watching over the forest and keeping her meticulous records of those who entered and never left. I left eventually, when the pull of the outside world became stronger than the pull of the forest. I took a job in another park, in another state, far from Signal Peak and its hungry shadows. But the forest never truly let me go. Even now, years later, I still dream of those trees. I still hear that voice calling my name in the darkness. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel it watching me, patient, eternal, waiting for the day when my fear returns. Because the truth I learned in that clearing was both a comfort and a curse. The Watcher doesn't chase, it doesn't hunt, it simply waits. Waits for the fear to build, for the isolation to do its work, for the moment when you're weakest and most alone. And then it comes. It comes with the silence and the shadows and the endless, hungry dark. And it takes what it has always taken, Not your body, not your soul, but your fear itself, consumed and digested and transformed into something that feeds its incomprehensible existence. I survived Signal Peak, but I know, with a certainty that sits cold and heavy in my chest, that one day the Watcher will come for me again. One day I will feel that presence behind me, that weight on my shoulders, that voice whispering my name, and on that day I will have to make the same choice I made in the clearing, to fear or to surrender, to fight or to accept. I don't know if I'll have the strength to do it again. I don't know if anyone can truly face that darkness more than once and come away unchanged. But I know one thing for certain. If you ever find yourself in a forest that feels wrong, if you ever hear a voice calling your name from the shadows, if you ever feel the presence of something ancient and patient watching you from between the trees, don't run. Don't fight. Don't let the fear consume you, because that's what it wants. That's what it has always wanted. Stand still, breathe, accept, and maybe, just maybe, you'll live to see the dawn. I never returned to Signal Peak after I left. The memories were too heavy, too haunting to revisit. But the forest didn't need my physical presence to remain a part of me. It had planted something inside me during those years, a seed of darkness that grew in the quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts. Sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary day, I would catch a scent on the wind, pine and decay and something older, something that didn't belong in the modern world, and I would be transported back to those endless trees, that pressing silence, that ever-present feeling of being watched. The new job was supposed to be a fresh start. Yellowstone was different from Signal Peak in every way that mattered. The trails were well-marked and heavily traveled. The rangers were friendly and professional. The wildlife was dangerous in normal, understandable ways. Bears and bison, and the occasional reckless tourist who thought the hot springs were a good place for a swim. For a while, I convinced myself that I had escaped. I threw myself into the work, learning new trails and new protocols, building relationships with colleagues who had no idea what I had experienced. I dated occasionally, though nothing ever lasted. There was a distance in me now, a part of myself that I kept locked away, and potential partners could sense it even if they couldn't name it. I started sleeping through the night again. Eventually, the dreams of the clearing faded, replaced by ordinary dreams about ordinary things. I almost convinced myself that Signal Peak had been a kind of extended hallucination, a product of stress and isolation and an overactive imagination. But the forest doesn't forget, and it doesn't let go. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late September, almost exactly 4 years after I had left Signal Peak. It was handwritten on yellowed paper, the script elegant and old-fashioned, and it carried a postmark from a town I didn't recognize. The return address simply said, "The Forest." I opened it with trembling hands. "Dear friend," the letter began, "you survived the Watcher, and for that, I commend you. Few have managed such a feat, and fewer still have done so with their minds intact. You found the truth that I discovered so many years ago, that fear is a choice, and that in choosing acceptance over resistance, we can deny the entity its sustenance. But I must warn you, your ordeal is not over. The Watcher remembers everyone who has looked upon it and lived. It is patient beyond our understanding, with a conception of time that dwarfs our brief human lives. You may think you have escaped, but you have only delayed the inevitable. There is a way to end this, a way to break free from the Watcher's attention forever. I discovered it too late to save myself, but I have spent my remaining years documenting everything I learned. If you wish to know the truth, come to the address below. Come alone. Come before the autumn equinox. And whatever you do, do not speak of this letter to anyone. There are those who would prevent you from learning what I have to share." The letter was signed with a single name, Dorothea. I sat for a long time, staring at that signature. Dorothea Crane had written her journal in the 1890s. If she had been a young woman then, say, in her 20s, she would have been born around 1870. That would make her over 150 years old. It was impossible, and yet the handwriting matched what I had seen in her journal, the same elegant loops and careful strokes. The paper smelled old, genuinely old, not like something artificially aged. And the knowledge contained in the letter, the understanding of the Watcher, the recognition of what I had experienced, could only have come from someone who had truly encountered the entity. I made my decision before I had fully processed what I was reading. I requested leave from work, citing a family emergency. I packed a bag with the essentials, clothes, supplies, the leather pouch that I still carried everywhere, and Dorothea's original journal. I loaded everything into my truck and set out for the address on the letter. The drive took 3 days. The address led me deep into the Appalachian Mountains, to a part of the country I had never visited before. The roads grew narrower and more winding as I went, until I was navigating single-lane tracks through forests that felt almost as old and silent as Signal Peak. I arrived at the house on the evening of the third day. It stood alone at the end of a dirt road, a Victorian structure that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and several windows were boarded over. But there was a light burning in one of the upper windows, and a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney. I parked my truck and approached the door. Before I could knock, it swung open, revealing a woman who appeared to be in her 70s. She was small and frail, with silver hair pulled back in a bun, and eyes that were clouded with cataracts but still somehow piercing. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something to herself. "You came," she said. Her voice was soft and papery, like dead leaves rustling in the wind. "I was afraid you wouldn't." I started to respond, but she held up a hand to silence me. "Not here," she said. "The forest has ears, even this far away. Come inside, quickly." The interior of the house was as worn as the exterior, but it was clean and surprisingly warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the walls were lined with bookshelves stuffed with volumes that looked even older than the woman who greeted me. She led me to a sitting room and gestured for me to take a seat. Then she settled into a chair across from me and fixed me with those clouded eyes. "You're wondering how I'm still alive," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She smiled, but there was no humor in it. "The same way I survived the Watcher, the same way you did. When you truly accept the darkness, when you surrender completely to the fear and let it pass through you without resistance, something happens, something changes. You become a part of the forest's pattern, its eternal rhythm, and the forest protects its own." She leaned forward, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "But it's not a gift. It's a curse. I've lived for over a century, watching everyone I love grow old and die while I remain unchanged. I've seen the world transform around me, seen wars and plagues and disasters that would have ended my life 1,000 times over if I were still fully human. But I'm not. Not anymore." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you saying?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. "The Watcher feeds on fear," she said. "But it also creates it. It's a cycle, a self-sustaining loop of terror and consumption. The entity exists because humans fear it, and humans fear it because it exists. Break the cycle, and you weaken the Watcher. Feed the cycle, and you strengthen it." I thought I had broken the cycle that night in the clearing. I thought that by accepting my fear, I had denied the Watcher its power over me, but I was wrong. I had only paused it. The connection was still there, buried deep inside me, waiting to be reactivated. She opened her eyes and looked at me with an intensity that was almost painful. "You feel it, don't you?" she said. "Even now, even here, miles away from Signal Peak, you feel it watching you." I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. The truth was that I had felt it ever since I left. A low-level awareness, a constant subtle presence at the edge of my consciousness. I had attributed it to trauma, to anxiety, to the natural aftermath of experiencing something so profound and terrible. But deep down, I had always known it was more than that. Dorothea nodded, as if reading my thoughts. "The Watcher marked you that night," she said, "just as it marked me over a century ago. We are bound to it now, connected by threads of fear and survival that transcend distance and time. We will never be free of it. Not fully, not unless we sever those threads at the source." I felt my heart begin to race. "How?" I asked. "What do we have to do?" Dorothea was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with weariness and sorrow. "The Watcher is not truly alive," she said. "Not in any sense we understand. It is more like a thought that has taken form, a concept that has become real. And like all thoughts, it has an origin, a place and time when it first came into being. I've spent 100 years researching, following the threads of folklore and legend across the world. And I've found it, the moment when the Watcher was born." She reached into a pocket of her dress and produced a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She handed it to me, and I unfolded it to reveal a hand-drawn map. It showed a region I didn't recognize, filled with symbols and notations in a language I had never seen. "In 1724, she continued, a group of settlers established a community in the mountains of what would later become Tennessee. They were fleeing religious persecution in Europe, seeking a place where they could practice their beliefs in peace. But their beliefs were not what we would consider orthodox. They worshipped something old, something they believed could grant them power over death and time." She pointed to a location on the map. They performed a ritual in these mountains, a ceremony designed to summon and bind an entity from the spaces between worlds. They believed they could control it, use it for their own purposes. They were wrong. The ritual worked, but not in the way they intended. The entity they summoned was not a servant, but a predator. It consumed them, not their bodies, but their minds, their fears, their very essences. And when it was done, it remained in the world they had called it to, anchored to the physical location where the ritual had been performed. That location, she said, is directly beneath what is now known as Signal Peak. I stared at the map, my mind reeling. You're saying the Watcher was created, I said. By humans. Dorothea nodded. It was not always here. It was brought here, summoned by those who thought they could command forces beyond their understanding. And because it was created, it can be destroyed. The ritual that brought it into being left a mark, a kind of metaphysical scar on the fabric of reality. If we can find that scar and reverse the process, we can send the Watcher back to wherever it came from. I felt a surge of hope, tempered by skepticism. If you've known this for over a century, why haven't you done it yourself? I asked. Dorothea's expression grew sad. Because I can't do it alone. The ritual requires two people who have been marked by the Watcher, two souls connected to it by shared experience. I have been marked, and now you have been marked. Together, we might have a chance. She reached out and took my hand in hers. Her skin was papery and cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. I know what I'm asking of you, she said. I know it sounds insane, impossible, but I've lived too long with this darkness inside me. I want it to end, one way or another, and I believe, with all my heart, that you are the one who can help me end it. I thought about Signal Peak, about the years I had spent there, about the things I had seen and the people I had lost. I thought about the constant presence I felt, the watchful eye that never fully closed. I thought about all the names in Agnes's notebook, all the souls consumed by the Watcher over the centuries, and I made my choice. When do we leave? I asked. Dorothea smiled, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope in her ancient eyes. Tomorrow at dawn. The journey back to Signal Peak took 4 days. Dorothea was not strong enough to travel quickly, and we had to stop frequently for rest. During those stops, she told me everything she knew about the Watcher, about the settlers who had summoned it, about the ritual they had performed and the one we would need to reverse it. The original ritual had been performed during a solar eclipse, using artifacts that the settlers had brought from Europe. Dorothea had spent decades tracking down those artifacts, and she had managed to recover 3 of the 4 required objects. The last one was still in the forest, buried at the site of the original ceremony. We would have to find it before we could complete the ritual. And there was another complication. The next solar eclipse visible from Signal Peak was only 5 days away. We had a narrow window of opportunity, and if we missed it, we would have to wait another 18 years for the next chance. The pressure was immense, but Dorothea seemed almost calm. She had been waiting for this moment for over a century. A few more days of tension were nothing compared to the weight of all those years. We arrived at Signal Peak on the morning of the 4th day. The ranger station looked exactly as I remembered it, though the paint was a bit more faded and the roof sagged a little more. Earl was long gone, retired to his coastal cottage, but Agnes was still there, older and grayer, but still sharp-eyed and watchful. She met us in the parking lot, her expression unreadable. "I knew you'd come back," she said to me. Then her gaze shifted to Dorothea, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "You must be the one from the journal." Dorothea nodded. "I am, and we need your help." Agnes studied us both for a long moment, then sighed and gestured toward the station. "Come inside. We have a lot to discuss." The next 2 days were a frenzy of preparation. Agnes proved invaluable, providing us with detailed maps of the forest, including areas that were not marked on any official documentation. She knew the location of the original ceremony site. It was one of the places that rangers were forbidden to enter, a restriction that had been in place for as long as anyone could remember. "The site is deep in the forest," she explained, spreading a map across the table. "About 8 miles from here, in a hollow that doesn't appear on any modern survey. The trees grow differently there. They're older, twisted. Some of the rangers call it the dead zone, though we're not supposed to talk about it officially." She looked at me with those penetrating eyes. "I've been there once, when I first started. I didn't stay long. The feeling there is stronger than anywhere else in the forest. It's like standing at the edge of a cliff, with something vast and dark waiting below." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "That's where we need to go," I said. "That's where the Watcher was born, and that's where we can destroy it." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a familiar leather pouch. She handed it to Dorothea. This was given to me by the ranger who trained me, who received it from the ranger before her, who received it from the ranger before that. It's been passed down for generations. I've always known what it was for, but I never had the courage to use it. Maybe you will. Dorothea opened the pouch and examined its contents. Her eyes widened, and she looked up at Agnes with an expression of wonder. The fourth artifact, she breathed. You had it all along. Agnes shrugged. It belongs to the forest. I was just keeping it safe until someone came along who could do what needed to be done. The eclipse was 2 days away. We spent the remaining time reviewing the ritual, practicing the words and gestures that Dorothea had reconstructed from her centuries of research. The language was ancient, older than Latin, older than Greek, possibly older than any language still spoken on Earth. The sounds felt strange in my mouth, alien and uncomfortable, but Dorothea assured me that pronunciation was less important than intent. What matters is what you feel, she said, what you believe. The Watcher was summoned by human desire and human fear. It can only be banished by human will and human acceptance. When you speak the words, you must truly mean them. You must be willing to face the darkness without flinching, without resisting. Can you do that? I thought about my experience in the clearing, about the moment of surrender that had saved my life. I thought about the presence I had felt ever since, the constant reminder that I was never truly alone, never truly safe. Yes, I said. I can do that. The day of the eclipse dawned cold and gray, with a thin layer of fog blanketing the forest floor. Dorothea and I set out at first light, carrying the artifacts and supplies we would need for the ritual. Agnes walked with us to the edge of the restricted zone, where she stopped and pressed something into my hand. I looked down and saw a small pendant, tarnished with age, bearing a symbol I didn't recognize. My grandmother gave me this, she said. She told me it would protect me from the things that wait in the darkness. I don't know if it's true, but I want you to have it. I tried to give it back, but she shook her head. I've had my time, she said. You two are the ones who are going to end this. If that pendant can help even a little, it belongs with you. She looked at us both, and I saw something I had never seen in her eyes before. Hope, good luck, and may God go with you. The journey into the restricted zone was unlike anything I had experienced before. The forest seemed to close in around us with every step, the trees growing denser and more twisted, their branches reaching toward us like grasping fingers. The fog thickened until we could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the silence was so complete that it felt like a physical pressure against my ears. Dorothea moved with a sureness that belied her apparent age, navigating the trackless forest as if following an invisible path. I realized that she had been here before, perhaps many times over her long life, studying the terrain and preparing for this moment. After 4 hours of walking, we reached the edge of the hollow. I knew it immediately, not from any visual landmark, but from the feeling that washed over me, a sense of wrongness so intense that it made my stomach lurch. This is it, Dorothea said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Beyond this point, the Watcher's power is at its strongest. Are you ready? I wasn't. I would never be ready for what lay ahead. But I nodded anyway, and together we descended into the hollow. The hollow was a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, surrounded on all sides by cliffs that rose toward a sky that was rapidly darkening as the moon began its transit across the sun. At the center of the hollow was a clearing, and at the center of the clearing was a stone, a massive black monolith that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. Dorothea gasped when she saw it. The anchor, she said. This is where they performed the ritual. This is where the Watcher entered our world. We approached the stone with caution, every sense alert for danger. But nothing moved in the hollow. Nothing stirred. Even the air was still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Dorothea began setting up the ritual, arranging the 4 artifacts at cardinal points around the stone. The first was an ancient dagger, its blade blackened with age but still sharp. The second was a mirror of polished obsidian, its surface dark and deep. The third was a book bound in leather that looked disturbingly like human skin, filled with words in that strange ancient language. And the fourth was the contents of the leather pouch, a collection of items that I now recognized as relics of the original settlers, personal effects that had been used to anchor the summoning ritual. As the eclipse reached totality, the world went dark. Not just dim, but truly dark, darker than any night I had ever experienced. The only light came from the artifacts, which had begun to glow with an eerie phosphorescence. And then the Watcher came. It rose from the stone like smoke from a fire, a column of darkness that coalesced into that terrible familiar form. It was larger here, more substantial, more real. Its non-eyes fixed on us with an intensity that felt like physical pressure, and I heard its voice in my mind, a torrent of whispers that spoke of fear and despair and endless, endless hunger. Dorothea began to chant, her voice rising and falling in the rhythms of that ancient language. I joined her, speaking the words she had taught me, forcing them out despite the terror that threatened to lock my throat. The Watcher seemed to shudder as the words washed over it. For a moment, I thought it might retreat, as it had retreated in the clearing years before. But then it surged forward, and I felt its presence slam into my mind like a battering ram. I saw things then. Terrible things. Things that no human was meant to see. I saw the origins of the Watcher, the space between spaces where it had dwelt before being summoned. I saw the settlers who had called it forth, their faces twisted with greed and fear as they realized what they had done. I saw every victim the Watcher had claimed over the centuries, their terror preserved in perfect clarity, their final moments of consciousness trapped within the entity's vast and hungry mind. And I saw myself. I saw every fear I had ever felt, every moment of weakness, every shameful secret. I saw the life I had lived and the death that awaited me, not an ending, but an absorption, a merging with the Watcher's consciousness that would preserve my fear forever, feeding the entity until the end of time. I felt my resistance crumbling, my will wavering. The ritual faltered as my voice failed, and I saw Dorothea struggling too, her face pale and drawn, her chant becoming ragged. We were losing. After all the preparation, all the sacrifice, we were losing. And then I remembered something. Not Dorothea's words, not the ritual, but something Agnes had said as we left the station that morning. May God go with you. I am not a religious person. I never have been. But in that moment, as darkness closed in around me and the Watcher's hunger threatened to consume everything I was, I found something beyond myself to hold on to. Not God, exactly, but something. A sense of connection, of belonging to something larger than my individual existence. I thought of Earl, spending his retirement by the ocean, finally at peace. I thought of Agnes, standing guard over the forest despite everything she had seen. I thought of Dorothea, who had waited over a century for this moment, who had carried the burden of knowledge and responsibility for longer than any human should have to bear. I thought of all the people who had entered Signal Peak and never left, all the souls the Watcher had consumed, and I felt something shift inside me. Not the surrender I had experienced in the clearing years before. This was different. This was not acceptance of fear, but acceptance of purpose. I was not here to survive. I was here to end this, to break the cycle that had claimed so many innocent lives. And if that meant sacrificing myself, so be it. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I looked at the Watcher, really looked at it, as I had once before, and I spoke the words of the ritual with a conviction I had never felt in my life. Dorothea joined me, her voice strengthening as she sensed the change in the air. Together we chanted, our voices rising in harmony, filling the hollow with sounds that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The Watcher screamed, not with voice, but with mind, with essence, with everything it was. The scream tore through my consciousness like a hurricane, and I felt things inside me breaking, shattering, being torn apart by forces I could not comprehend. But I kept chanting, and Dorothea kept chanting, and the artifacts blazed with light so intense that it seemed to burn the darkness itself. The stone at the center of the clearing began to crack. Lines of fire spread across its surface, and from those cracks poured something that might have been light, and might have been heat, and might have been the raw stuff of reality itself. The Watcher was being pulled toward those cracks, drawn back to the place it had come from, the space between spaces that was its true home. It fought. Of course it fought. It had existed in our world for almost 300 years, and it did not want to leave. It threw everything it had against us: fear, despair, pain, the accumulated horrors of centuries of predation. But we held firm, and finally, with one last terrible scream, the Watcher was gone. It happened between one heartbeat and the next. The darkness collapsed in on itself, folding into the cracks in the stone, and then the stone exploded outward, showering the hollow with fragments of black rock that dissolved into nothing as they flew through the air. The eclipse ended. Light returned to the world. And for the first time since I had arrived at Signal Peak all those years ago, I felt truly and completely alone. Not the lonely isolation of being watched by something dark and hungry, but the peaceful solitude of simply being myself, with no presence pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I turned to Dorothea to celebrate our victory, to share the moment of triumph we had fought so hard to achieve. But she was not standing beside me. She was lying on the ground, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. I rushed to her side and took her hand, feeling for a pulse, praying that she had simply fainted from the exertion. But I knew even before I felt the stillness in her wrist, the absence of breath in her chest. Dorothea Crane was dead. She had survived for over a century, sustained by the connection to the Watcher that had also been her curse. When that connection was severed, when the entity was banished from our world, there was nothing left to keep her in it. I sat with her body for a long time as the sun emerged fully from behind the moon and warm light filled the hollow. I thought about everything she had sacrificed, everything she had endured, all the years of loneliness and research and hope. She had lived long enough to see the end of her nightmare. That was something, at least. I buried her in the hollow, in the spot where the stone had stood. It seemed fitting, somehow. She had spent her life fighting the darkness, and now she would rest at the place where she had finally defeated it. I marked the grave with a simple cross made from 2 branches tied together with a strip of cloth, and I said a few words that I hoped might bring her peace. Then I walked out of the forest. Agnes was waiting for me at the station, and she knew from my face that something had changed. "The Watcher?" she asked. "Gone," I said. "For good." She closed her eyes and let out a breath that seemed to carry decades of tension with it. "And Dorothea?" I shook my head, and Agnes nodded slowly. She knew the price. She was willing to pay it. We stood in silence for a moment, honoring the woman who had given everything to end a centuries-old nightmare. Then Agnes straightened up and looked at me with those sharp, ancient eyes. What now? I thought about the question. I had come to Signal Peak expecting nothing but a paycheck and a place to hide from my failed life. I had found something else entirely. Purpose, strength, understanding. And now, with the Watcher gone and Dorothea at rest, I had to decide what to do with that understanding. I could leave. I could return to Yellowstone, or go somewhere else entirely, somewhere with no memories of darkness and fear. I could try to build a normal life, to forget everything I had experienced and just be a regular person with a regular job. But I knew, even as I considered it, that I couldn't do that. Signal Peak might be free of the Watcher, but there were other forests, other places where darkness dwelt. There were other people who would stumble into those places unprepared, who would face things they couldn't understand, who would need someone to help them find their way back to the light. I looked at Agnes, and I made my decision. "I'm staying," I said. "Someone needs to watch the forest." Agnes smiled, the first genuine smile I had ever seen on her face. Good. I could use the help. I stayed at Signal Peak for another 10 years. Agnes retired eventually, passing the torch to me just as Earl had passed it to her. I trained new rangers, taught them what I knew about the forest and its secrets. I told them about Dorothea and the Watcher, about the ritual and the hollow and the price of victory. Some believed me. Others thought I was just a crazy old-timer with too many stories. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the forest was safe now. The disappearances stopped, not completely, because there will always be accidents and misadventures in any wilderness, but the unexplained vanishings that had plagued Signal Peak for centuries came to an end. Hikers walked into the forest and walked out again. Campers spent nights in backcountry cabins and woke up in the morning unharmed. The leather-bound notebook in the desk drawer grew no new entries. I retired last spring, 53 years to the day after I first drove into that gravel parking lot with everything I owned stuffed into a duffel bag and an overstuffed backpack. I bought a little cabin on the edge of a lake, far from any forest, and I spend my days fishing and reading and enjoying the simple pleasure of silence that is just silence, nothing more. But I still think about Signal Peak. I think about Earl and Agnes, about Dorothea and the Watcher, about all the people whose names fill that notebook and whose stories will never be told. I think about the fear I felt and the peace I found, about the moment when I stopped running and started fighting, about the cost of victory and the value of sacrifice. And sometimes, late at night, when the darkness presses in and the silence grows heavy, I remember what it felt like to stand in that clearing and face something beyond human comprehension. I remember the terror and the acceptance and the strange, fierce joy of knowing that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I needed to do. The Watcher is gone, the forest is safe, but the darkness remains, out there somewhere, in the spaces between spaces, waiting for the next foolish human to call it forth. And when that happens, when some new entity rises to threaten the innocent and the unprepared, I hope there will be someone like Dorothea, someone like Agnes, someone like me, ready to face it, ready to fight, ready to win. Because that's what we do, us watchers of the forest. We stand between the darkness and the light, and we hold the line, no matter the cost, no matter the fear, no matter what waits in the shadows between the trees. I didn't take the job at Signal Peak because I wanted it. I took it because everything else had fallen apart. But what I found there, what I became there, was worth every moment of terror, every sleepless night, every brush with the incomprehensible dark. The forest made me who I am, and I wouldn't change a thing. Except maybe I would tell Dorothea, if I could, that her sacrifice wasn't in vain, that the world is a little bit safer because of what she did, that her name, at least, will not be forgotten. Because I remember. And as long as I remember, she lives on, not in the hungry darkness of the watcher, but in the warm light of human memory, where the best parts of us are preserved forever. That's the only immortality that matters in the end, not the endless years of existence, but the impact we leave behind, the people we save, the darkness we push back, the hope we kindle in others, even when our own hope has run dry. I started my career at Signal Peak as a broken man with nothing to lose. I ended it as something else entirely. Not whole exactly, but healed, changed, tempered by fire and darkness into something stronger than I ever thought I could be. And now, in the quiet twilight of my years, I can finally rest. The forest is watching, but it watches with protective eyes now, not hungry ones. And somewhere in the hollow, beneath the earth where the black stone once stood, Dorothea Crane sleeps the long sleep of the victorious dead. May she dream of light, and may the darkness never touch her again. This is my story. This is Signal Peak's story. And now that I've told it, perhaps I can finally let it go. But I know deep in my heart that I never truly will. Some things become part of you. Some places sink into your bones and never leave. Signal Peak is in my blood, in my breath, in the pattern of my thoughts. It will be with me until the day I die, and perhaps beyond. And I wouldn't have it any other way. If you ever find yourself at the edge of a forest that feels wrong, remember what I've told you. Remember the Watcher, and the Hollow, and the ritual that ended 300 years of darkness. Remember Dorothea and Agnes and Earl, and all the others who gave their lives to protecting the innocent from things they couldn't understand. And remember me, not as a hero, I was never that, but as a survivor. Someone who faced the darkness and found a way through to the other side. Someone who learned that fear is not the enemy, but surrender to fear is. Someone who discovered that even in the deepest shadows, there is always a path back to the light. The forest is calling. The darkness is waiting. But as long as there are those willing to answer that call, willing to face that darkness, the light will endure. I have to believe that. After everything I've seen, everything I've experienced, that belief is all that keeps me going. The story of Signal Peak is over. The Watcher is gone. The nightmare has ended. But the forest remains. And as long as the forest remains, there will be need for those who watch over it. Those who stand guard against the unknown. Those who remember. So if you're young and lost and desperate, if you've got nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go, maybe consider applying to the Forest Service. The pay isn't great, the hours are long, and you might encounter things that defy explanation. But you might also find what I found: purpose, belonging, the chance to make a difference in a world that often seems beyond saving. That's what the forest gave me. That's what it could give you. Just remember, if you hear a voice calling your name in the darkness, don't answer, never answer. And always, always keep the leather pouch close to your heart. You never know when you might need it.